It is hard to believe that a simple cup of coffee, something people used to brew at home for just a few cents, could turn into a global lifestyle symbol worth billions. Yet Starbucks didn't just sell coffee. It sold a dream, an identity, a ritual. And the way they did it wasn't by accident. It was a calculated blend of psychology, culture shaping, and marketing so subtle, you barely realized you were being influenced. By the time you walked into a Starbucks store, you weren't just buying a drink. You were buying into a feeling, a story, a community. But how did Starbucks pull this off? And why, even today, does their green siren logo still trigger cravings in millions of people worldwide? Before we dive into the story, if you enjoy exploring how brands shape our lives and want more deep dives like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and means you won't miss the next story behind the world's biggest ideas. Let's rewind the clock. The year is 1971. In Seattle, three friends, an English teacher, a writer, and a history teacher, decided to open a small shop selling coffee beans and equipment. They called it Starbucks. At that point, there was no master plan to dominate the world. They weren't trying to reinvent culture. They were simply inspired by the romance of coffee and the Italian tradition of sourcing high-quality beans. But the real transformation didn't happen until Howard Schultz entered the picture a decade later. Schultz wasn't just a businessman. He was an observer, a traveler, a man who noticed details others overlooked. In 1983, while visiting Milan, he experienced the Italian coffeehouse culture. The espresso bars weren't just places to grab caffeine. They were vibrant community hubs where conversations flowed, friendships sparked, and life slowed down just enough to savor the moment. Schultz had a revelation. Coffee could be more than a product. It could be an experience. This realization would become the cornerstone of Starbucks' empire. When Schultz pushed the idea of transforming Starbucks from a bean retailer into a cafe-driven culture, the original founders resisted. They didn't want to dilute their identity as purists. But Schultz was relentless. He eventually bought the company in 1987 and began reshaping it into the Starbucks we know today. Here's where the marketing genius comes in. Starbucks didn't advertise in the traditional sense at first. They weren't flooding television with commercials or plastering billboards. Instead, they turned every store into a form of marketing. A living, breathing ad you could walk into. The lighting, the smell of fresh coffee, the music playlist carefully chosen to match the mood. All of it was designed to transport you. The stores were the message. Think about it. When you walk into a Starbucks, you instantly know you're not just in a cafe. The atmosphere tells you how to feel. Comfortable, connected, even a little bit special. The green logo, the baristas calling out your name, the leather chairs, the quiet hum of laptops. It's not an accident. It's engineered culture. And culture is much more powerful than any commercial. One of the smartest moves Starbucks ever made was how they changed our language. Ordering a tall, grande, or venti wasn't just quirky branding. It was a subtle way of making you feel like you were part of an exclusive club. You weren't just ordering coffee. You were speaking the language of Starbucks. And language has power. It binds people together. It turns customers into insiders. Suddenly saying, "I'll have a venti caramel macchiato," felt like a small act of identity, not just a transaction. But there's a deeper layer here. Starbucks wasn't just selling you a drink. They were selling you time, status, and belonging. Why would people pay $5 for coffee they could make at home for 50 cents? Because Starbucks convinced them that what they were really buying was a third place. Not home, not work, but a comforting space in between. A place where you could linger, work, meet, or simply escape. That's not coffee. That's therapy disguised as caffeine. This strategy tapped into a human need far beyond thirst. The need for connection and identity. And Starbucks became the ultimate symbol of aspirational middle-class life. Carrying that cup with the logo wasn't just convenient. It was a statement. It said, "I'm modern, I'm busy, I'm part of the global culture." That's a level of marketing most companies never achieve. But let's pause here. Imagine how radical this was in the 1990s. Fast food chains were all about speed, value, and consistency. Coffee shops, if they existed, were often dingy diners or small local cafés. Starbucks walked in and said, "No, we're going to slow you down, charge you more, and make you thank us for it." And somehow it worked. Why? Because Schultz understood something about psychology that others didn't. People crave experiences as much as, if not more than, products. There's another psychological lever Starbucks mastered: customization. When you walk into a Starbucks, you have dozens of choices. Soy milk, almond milk, oat milk, extra foam, no foam, double shot, half calf, flavored syrup. You're not just buying coffee, you're co-creating it. That sense of personalization makes the product feel more valuable because it feels like yours. And here's the kicker. When you've invested in choosing every detail of your drink, you're more attached to it. It's not just coffee, it's your coffee. And then there's the infamous name-calling ritual. Baristas write your name on the cup and call it out. Simple, right? But psychologically, it's genius. It personalizes the experience, it forces a brief social interaction, and it creates moments of humor and imperfection. Like when your name gets hilariously misspelled. People even share those mistakes online, turning free marketing into viral content. This blend of culture, language, personalization, and ritual transformed Starbucks into something far bigger than a coffee shop. It became a stage where millions of tiny human dramas played out every day. First dates, business meetings, solo study sessions, quiet escapes. Starbucks didn't just build a brand. They built a backdrop for modern life. Of course, the rise wasn't without challenges. There were critics who called Starbucks overpriced and pretentious. There were accusations of homogenizing culture, of pushing out local cafes. And yet, despite all the backlash, the green siren kept spreading, city after city, country after country. By the mid-2000s, Starbucks had become a global giant with thousands of locations, and it seemed unstoppable. But what's fascinating is how Starbucks weathered the storm of changing tastes and economic downturns. Take the 2008 financial crisis, for example. Suddenly, spending $5 on coffee seemed like a luxury people couldn't afford. Starbucks sales dropped, and competitors like McDonald's began pushing their cheaper espresso drinks. For a moment, it looked like Starbucks might stumble. But instead of panicking, Schultz returned as CEO and refocused the brand on its core values: quality, experience, connection. They retrained baristas, simplified menus, and doubled down on the very essence of what made Starbucks different. That move saved the company. Even in this recovery, marketing played a quiet but powerful role. Starbucks launched loyalty programs that turned occasional customers into regulars. They embraced digital payments and mobile apps early, making the act of buying coffee seamless and modern. They even introduced seasonal drinks, like the Pumpkin Spice Latte, that became cultural phenomena, dominating social media and embedding Starbucks deeper into pop culture. Think about that for a second. A seasonal drink became a meme, a lifestyle symbol, and a billion-dollar product line. The Pumpkin Spice Latte isn't just a flavor, it's a cultural moment. That's the kind of marketing magic Starbucks mastered, turning ordinary things into rituals people wait for every year. And here's the deeper insight. Starbucks built a brand not by chasing trends, but by shaping them. They didn't ask, "What do people want right now?" They asked, "How can we create a need people didn't even know they had?" Before Starbucks, nobody said, "I need a third place." Nobody demanded coffee in a grande cup. Nobody thought pumpkin spice belonged in a latte. But once Starbucks introduced these things, they became essential. This is the genius of their marketing. It's not about shouting louder than competitors. It's about whispering ideas into culture until people believe they were always there. Starbucks also understood something that most companies overlook. Consistency builds trust, but small doses of surprise build excitement. Walk into any Starbucks in Tokyo, New York, or Paris, and the core experience feels familiar. The logo, the ordering process, the vibe. It's recognizable and comforting. Yet, if you look closer, you'll notice local twists. A matcha latte in Japan, a dulce de leche frappuccino in Latin America, or regional pastries inspired by local tastes. This balance between global consistency and local adaptation is why Starbucks doesn't feel like a foreign invader, but rather a brand that gets you wherever you are. But the story gets even more interesting when you consider how Starbucks positioned itself against competition. Think about it. In a market dominated by fast food giants who sold coffee as a quick add-on, Starbucks had the audacity to slow everything down. They turned coffee from a utility into a luxury. This wasn't about caffeine efficiency, it was about lifestyle branding. McDonald's sells you coffee because you're tired. Starbucks sells you coffee because you want to feel alive. That's a massive difference. There's another layer that made Starbucks stand out: aspirational branding. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Starbucks became shorthand for success. In movies and TV shows, characters who carried a Starbucks cup were often portrayed as ambitious professionals, creatives, or sophisticated urbanites. Without paying for product placement in every instance, Starbucks became part of cultural storytelling. It was almost like an accessory, just as symbolic as a nice watch or a designer bag. And the best part? It was accessible. You didn't need to be rich to signal that lifestyle. For a few dollars, anyone could buy into that aspirational image. Of course, this clever positioning also had its dark side. Critics argued Starbucks created coffee snobbery, that it inflated the price of something simple and convinced people it was special. Yet even the critics couldn't deny the genius. Starbucks made people care about coffee in ways they never had before. Suddenly, customers were talking about bean origins, roasting levels, foam textures, milk alternatives. Coffee became an identity, and Starbucks was at the center of it. Now let's talk about one of the most underrated aspects of their marketing: sensory branding. Starbucks doesn't just rely on logos or slogans. They appeal to all 5 senses. Smell? That fresh coffee aroma hits you before you even see the menu. Sound? The curated background playlists that make the store feel calm but alive. Sight? The warm wood interiors, the green logo, the handwritten names on cups. Touch? The weight of the cup, the texture of the sleeve, the comfort of the leather chair. Taste, of course, seals the deal. It's not just branding, it's full immersion. And when a brand engages all your senses, it imprints itself deeper into memory. But perhaps one of the boldest marketing moves Starbucks made was creating exclusivity out of something available everywhere. Coffee is one of the most common drinks on Earth. How do you make it special? You don't compete on product, you compete on perception. Starbucks never said, "Our coffee is the cheapest." They implied, "Our coffee is part of a ritual, a higher standard, a little luxury you deserve." That framing makes the same product feel different, more valuable, more personal. And then, of course, came digital domination. Starbucks was one of the first big brands to truly nail mobile ordering and payments. Their app didn't just make buying coffee faster, it gamified the entire experience. Every star you earned, every reward you unlocked, turned coffee drinking into a game. Suddenly, people weren't just customers, they were players chasing achievements. And that psychological loop, buy, earn, redeem, kept customers loyal in ways traditional loyalty cards never could. Let us pause and ask a question. Why did Starbucks invest so heavily in digital when they could have simply relied on their brand power? The answer is simple. They knew customer habits evolve. By making themselves indispensable in daily routines, not just as a cafe, but as an app, a payment method, a reward system, they became embedded in everyday life. Deleting Starbucks from your life would feel like deleting a useful tool, not just a store. That's marketing that locks you in for the long haul. At this point, it's tempting to think Starbucks' success was inevitable. But that's far from true. For every Starbucks, there are dozens of brands that tried and failed to create culture. The difference is that Starbucks understood timing, psychology, and storytelling. They entered the market when urban culture was shifting, when people wanted spaces outside work and home, when globalization made aspirational brands appealing. They rode those waves with precision. And they weren't just selling coffee. They were selling belonging in a world that felt increasingly disconnected. But what happens when your own success becomes your enemy? As Starbucks grew, it faced backlash. The more stores they opened, the more they were accused of killing local cafe culture. The more popular they became, the more people mocked them as basic, mainstream, and overpriced. And yet, here's the paradox. Even the criticism kept Starbucks in the cultural conversation. Being loved and hated is better than being ignored. So how did Starbucks respond to this image crisis? By leaning even harder into identity. They doubled down on limited editions, seasonal offerings, and Instagram-worthy drinks designed to spark conversation. Think of the unicorn frappuccino, or the holiday red cups. These weren't just drinks, they were cultural flashpoints. Suddenly, Starbucks wasn't just a cafe, it was a trend generator. Whether you loved or hated the products didn't matter. What mattered was that you were talking about them. Another stroke of brilliance was how Starbucks subtly marketed themselves as a socially conscious company. They began emphasizing ethical sourcing, fair trade, environmental responsibility, and community initiatives. Whether or not every claim held up to scrutiny, the image mattered. Starbucks wasn't just selling coffee. They were selling coffee with conscience. And in a world where consumers increasingly want to feel good about their purchases, that was a powerful differentiator. Still, Starbucks walked a delicate line. Too much emphasis on being corporate and global, and they risked losing the sense of personal community. Too much emphasis on being socially conscious, and skeptics accused them of greenwashing. But here's the clever part. Starbucks never positioned themselves as perfect. They framed themselves as trying, always striving, always improving. And that humility made customers forgive them in ways they might not forgive other massive corporations. Now let's look at an often overlooked detail: the way Starbucks shaped modern work culture. The rise of laptops, freelancing, and remote work coincided with the rise of Starbucks. Suddenly, people weren't just grabbing coffee and leaving. They were staying, working, creating. Starbucks didn't push them out. They embraced it. They provided Wi-Fi, comfortable seating, and an atmosphere that said, "It's okay to linger." This wasn't just generosity. It was strategy. Every extra minute you spent in Starbucks increased the chance you'd order another drink, a pastry, maybe both. And while you sat there, you were also marketing Starbucks for free, sitting with the logo on your cup in full view of passers-by. By turning their stores into unofficial offices, Starbucks tapped into the future of work before anyone else. And in doing so, they made themselves indispensable to an entire generation of professionals. You weren't just working, you were working at Starbucks. That carried a subtle prestige, a signal that you were part of a modern global lifestyle. There's a fascinating paradox here. Starbucks became huge by making people feel small. Think about it. In a city of millions, where you can feel anonymous and insignificant, Starbucks gives you a place where the barista knows your name, even if they misspell it. That tiny acknowledgement breaks the coldness of urban life. And when you multiply that experience across millions of people, you create loyalty that money can't buy. But here's where it gets even more strategic. Starbucks didn't just build cafés, they built stages for personal stories. A first date over lattes, a college student pulling an all-nighter, a novelist writing their first chapter. These aren't Starbucks ads. They're human lives unfolding in Starbucks spaces. And the brilliance is that the company doesn't have to pay for these stories. They just create the setting. The customers do the storytelling themselves. At the same time, Starbucks never let go of innovation. They constantly tested new formats, drive-thrus, reserve roasteries, delivery options. Each new experiment wasn't just about selling more coffee. It was about staying relevant in changing lifestyles. They knew the danger of becoming stale, of being yesterday's trend, so they kept reinventing themselves, not too much to alienate customers, but just enough to stay fresh. And perhaps the most impressive part is how Starbucks built a brand with almost no reliance on traditional advertising. For decades, they barely touched TV commercials. Instead, they let the stores, the culture, the customers, and the products do the talking. That's marketing at its highest form, when your very existence is the campaign. As we move closer to the present, Starbucks faces new challenges: rising competition, health-conscious trends, economic shifts, and cultural pushback. Yet even with all these pressures, the brand continues to thrive. Why? Because Starbucks didn't just build a coffee chain. They built a mindset. They turned a beverage into an experience, a daily ritual, a cultural anchor. To understand Starbucks' endurance, we need to recognize a truth about human behavior. Once something becomes part of your identity, it's incredibly difficult to give it up. Starbucks didn't just enter people's routines, it fused itself with their sense of self. Morning coffee wasn't just a caffeine fix anymore, it was a ritual that framed the day. That ritual was wrapped in symbols, smells, and stories. Break the ritual, and you don't just lose coffee, you lose a piece of yourself. That's why even in times of crisis, Starbucks held on to its loyal base. But this power also raised ethical questions. When a company knows how to influence culture and identity so deeply, where's the line between inspiration and manipulation? Starbucks convinced millions to spend far more than necessary on a basic commodity. It created desires that didn't exist before, rituals that made people dependent on the brand. And yet most customers didn't feel tricked. They felt grateful. They liked belonging to something bigger than themselves. That's the strange paradox of great marketing. It can blur the line between genuine value and carefully crafted illusion. One of Starbucks' cleverest long-term strategies was its ability to embrace criticism and spin it into strength. Think about the stereotype of the basic Starbucks drinker ordering a pumpkin spice latte. Instead of running from the joke, Starbucks leaned into it. They made the drink even more iconic, knowing that every meme, every parody, every sarcastic remark only fueled its cultural dominance. If people are laughing at you but still buying, you're winning. This self-awareness is part of why Starbucks never became outdated. They know they're not the edgiest brand in the world. They're not trying to be underground or rebellious. They position themselves as comfort, as familiarity, as something reliable in a chaotic world. That brand positioning, warmth over coolness, reliability over rebellion, might sound boring, but it's powerful, because trends come and go. But comfort never goes out of style. Now let's zoom out and ask, what lessons can other brands, or even individuals, take from Starbucks' rise? First, they mastered the art of storytelling. Starbucks never just said, "We sell coffee." They told a story about connection, about the third place, about bringing Italian espresso culture to America, about ethically sourced beans. People don't remember prices. They remember stories. And if you want to build influence, you need a story that resonates with human needs, not just wallets. Second, they created rituals. A ritual is different from a habit. A habit is unconscious, automatic. A ritual is intentional, emotional, symbolic. writing names on cups, seasonal drinks, red holiday cups. These are rituals, and rituals build communities. If you want loyalty, don't just sell a product. Create a ritual people want to repeat. Third, they understood psychology. Personalization makes people feel important. Consistency makes people feel safe. Exclusivity makes people feel special. Starbucks blended all three. That's why the brand feels bigger than coffee. It feels personal, safe, and elevated, all at once. Fourth, they innovated without losing their soul. Every new experiment, apps, delivery, drive-through, was layered onto the same foundation of community and experience. Too much change, and customers would feel lost. Too little change, and they'd feel bored. Starbucks walked that line carefully, and it's one reason they stayed relevant decade after decade. Finally, Starbucks proved that environments are marketing. The stores themselves did the advertising. The smell, the sound, the atmosphere, that was the campaign. And this is a lesson for anyone. The experience you create around your product often matters more than the product itself. But what about the future? The world is shifting again. Health-conscious consumers are questioning sugary lattes. Younger generations are seeking authenticity and sustainability. Global competition is fiercer than ever. Can Starbucks hold on to its cultural crown? Here's the twist. Starbucks doesn't need to dominate coffee forever to remain iconic. They've already cemented their place in history. Even if trends change, the idea of Starbucks, the brand as a cultural reference point, will remain. Just like Coca-Cola became more than soda, Starbucks became more than coffee. It's a symbol of a particular era of globalization, urban life, and identity-driven consumerism. And symbols last far longer than products. But the company isn't standing still. They're experimenting with plant-based alternatives, high-end reserve roasteries, and even digital loyalty innovations tied to blockchain. They're trying to adapt without losing what made them special. Will every gamble succeed? Of course not. But the willingness to adapt is exactly what keeps them alive. At the same time, Starbucks faces growing cultural critique. Is it right for one company to dominate so many city corners, shaping the very feel of urban life? Is it healthy for people to spend thousands a year on coffee drinks, chasing identity through consumption? These questions don't have easy answers, but they do remind us that the story of Starbucks is also the story of us. Our desires, our loneliness, our need for rituals and belonging. Starbucks is a mirror. It shows us not just what we drink, but who we are when we drink it. And that's the final genius of their marketing. It wasn't about convincing you that Starbucks was great. It was about convincing you that Starbucks was you. Your lifestyle, your taste, your time, your identity, poured into a cup with your name on it. Once you understand that, you realize Starbucks isn't really in the coffee business. They're in the identity business. Coffee is just the medium. So next time you see someone holding a Starbucks cup, or you find yourself walking into one of their stores, remember, you are not just looking at a coffee company. You're looking at one of the most skillful cultural architects of the last 50 years. They didn't just build a brand, they built a culture. A culture where a simple drink became a language, a ritual, a status symbol, and a comfort all rolled into one. And maybe that's why Starbucks endures. Because in a world of constant change, a world where identity is fragile and belonging feels rare, sometimes what people want most is a warm cup of coffee, and the feeling that, for a moment, they belong. Starbucks gave them that. And that, more than any latte or frappuccino, is their most brilliant creation. If you enjoyed this deep dive into how Starbucks built more than coffee, and want more stories about the hidden strategies shaping our world, make sure to subscribe for the next video.